Leslie Robertson. I'm quoting here, right here. Well, that's kind of the nature of that kind of failure. What I can assure you is that once the upper floors of the building started to fall, there was nothing that could have saved those towers. They would have collapsed, in my view, symmetrically.
So he's saying the symmetrical collapse of these buildings is expected. What we have, though, is an unexpected 12 to 1,400 foot debris radius, this lateral ejection, everything blowing outside of the building's 207-foot footprint. 98% of that material is landing well outside. This is supposed to be a gravitational collapse, and yet we will be looking, in fact, for a few floors down there, outside the boundaries of ground zero. Here is the classic controlled demolition of Building 7, a nice, neat implosion. Compare that to the very explosive, completely destructive shredding of steel in the very energetic Twin Towers destruction. Do we have squibs or these isolated explosive ejections?
In all the videos of the collapses, explosions can be seen bursting from the building 20 to 30 stories below the demolition wave. Here, here,
Those are flashes, right? Those are explosive flashes.
here,
Smoke. No, the top.
here, here, and here.
Dave Thomas.
Like the little explosions Richard was describing under the windows, that was the air being pushed out of the towers. When you pump up a bicycle, you can feel that resistance as you're pumping it up. And then it, comes out the tiny needle. Well, that's what was happening. As this big air column was pushed, it came down through elevators, popped open windows, and those were the puffs that you saw even, 30 floors below the collapse front.
The problem is that these are not puffs of air. First of all, they're pulverized building materials. They're being ejected out of the building at 160 to 200 feet per second. These are propelled by explosive speeds, not air pressure. And they're 20, 40, and even 60 stories down below the crush zone, so-called. And if this were, say, the 60-foot open office planning in the Twin Towers, and the elevator hoistways, that air is coming down there like that big piston, pushing it into this open area, blowing through the windows behind, that air pressure is going to equalize in those large rooms, and if it blows out any of those windows, it might blow all of them out, but not these highly focalized, geometrically precise, violent ejections that are pinpoint accurate. Do we have a near free fall pace through the path of greatest resistance?
Again, Dave.
Was when I look at my new physics model and basically look at the fall of the towers as not some average 2/3 sort of average smoothed out acceleration, but what really happened, a free fall and then a violent impact, a collision, a deceleration of 30 Gs for only a couple milliseconds.
Again, I alluded to it earlier. This fellow wants to say he has free fall and then an impact. Well, he has no evidence. First of all, free fall can occur, and I explained why. You can't free fall through buckling columns. There's a minimum resistance, and it's high. Even with a factor of safety of just 2, it can't fall at a greater rate than half of that of gravity, because the buckling resistance is at least 25% times 2.
What we're basically told is that this 15-story section here over nothing but air, next to it a 15-story section held up by this giant crane over, say, 80,000 tons of structural steel designed to resist it, in fact, 3 to 5 times stronger than it needs to be. NIST tells us, but basically these are going to hit the ground at the same time when that lever is released. How many of us think that that is a rational conclusion or hypothesis? This is 7th grade physics.
Right. Well, he says one other thing, Dave Thomas. He says that there's impacts. Like I said, there's no evidence of that. The building has to decelerate, that upper section, and in all of those Varanage demolitions, that deceleration is measurable. It's not measured in the North Tower. There is no deceleration. There can't be any impacts occurring. So he's wrong.
Here's the problem. That 15-story section doesn't even exist, people. It has been destroyed in the first 4 seconds, as you have already seen. After that, it's the building tearing itself apart and at nearly free-fall acceleration, 2/3 of free-fall acceleration. So the whole theory of the pile driver in and of itself bears no resemblance to what we see in the video.
And even if there were an intact section, you can see that most of the material, even this early in the collapse, is falling outside the footprint of the building. It can't be pressing on the building if it's outside the building.
Barzan, the vertical impact of the mass of the upper part onto the lower part applies enormous vertical dynamic load on the underlying structure, far exceeding its load capacity.
Yeah, I'll just say real fast. Dr. Bazan is just another one, just like Dave Thomas and John Magnuson, that assumes a dynamic load. They never measured the descent of these upper sections. We have, and they still haven't measured them after we told them they were wrong. They want to assume a dynamic load. That's not science. They never measured for it.
But here's science and experimentation. We learn a lot by looking at what has been done. And here we capture on videos what a building looks like when it's under a dynamic pile driver type load. You'll have to see that one in the video. Do we have the total dismemberment of the steel structure? It certainly appears that way. Let's in fact watch the South Tower the whole building is destroyed save these shards of perimeter columns down at the base. Let's take a look at the South Tower now, which was hit down about the 30 stories below the top of the building. And let's see. This building has leaned well off its center of balance. It's the axis of the building. It's 22 degrees and theoretically continuing its angular momentum. How can it drive the rest of the building down when it's falling off the top? We have asymmetrical damage from the loading of this falling piece of the building, asymmetrical damage from the airplanes, and asymmetrical damage from the fires. What do we see from below? When these videos play, what we see is complete symmetry all the way down the building. It's absolutely amazing, just like the fireman described, like belts all the way down the building, where the steel skeleton is broken up and ready for shipment.
Ready? John Magnuson.
Several of the upper floors fell onto the next lower floor that was still intact. And once that happens, there's going to be an instant overload situation, and then it will fail.
Where are the floors, in fact, if that's true? If we have a gravitational collapse down to the bottom, we would be expecting to see 110 floors stacked up, not neatly, damaged certainly, 4-inch thick concrete, 1 acre in size each of these floors, 220 acres. We'd expect to see maybe half of them, maybe a quarter of them. How many do we see? None. We see a 2-story pile of columns, beams. The floors have been completely pulverized, ejected laterally. This bears no resemblance to a classic pancaking collapse. Now, here's a pancaking collapse on the right, where we would expect to see some pancakes.
Again, we got Dave.
Look at the concrete. It's hard to blow up concrete. It's hard to put dynamite and pulverize concrete. But if you drop it in a gravitational collapse that releases 942 gigajoules of energy just collapsing, yes, that concrete can get pulverized.
Again, Dave Thomas assumes a dynamic load. He has no evidence for it. He also assumes a free fall, which I explained was impossible. So without a dynamic load, this structure is not collapsing, and he is assuming that a priori, and it's not true.
There's so many things wrong with what he's saying and implying. It's hard to know in the time we have what to say about it. I mean, for one thing, a pancake can collapse even if it destroyed the floors. How would it destroy the columns that were holding up all the floors? It was strong enough to hold a building about 6 times as tall as it was wide against 100-mile-an-hour winds at the top. Can you imagine the force that the wind would push on those towers with? And they had to not just resist without falling over, they had to not sway very much because people would get seasick in the top floors of the building if it's doing this at the wrong rate. And so you have this incredible stiffness, this incredible reinforced structure for these buildings. And if you have, there's no steel strong enough to just not bend. You also have steel on 2 sides. If it's getting pushed over to one side, you have vertical strength also, because if you're pushing over, you're also pushing down. So the towers are extremely overbuilt. He throws a fancy word at you like gigajoules, and you go, oh, well, he must know what he's talking about, but he doesn't. You have to just, for the results we got, you had to destroy the concrete, you had to rip the steel apart 80, 90%. You see a few big sections falling, but most of the steel you see is ripped apart down to individual steel sections. It's being flung outward, that's more energy. It's being flung, it's being accelerated at 2/3 of gravity downward. That's 2/3 of its gravitational potential energy being converted into motion downward. That leaves you only 1/3 of the original gravitational potential energy to do all the other damage. The numbers don't add up. You can find these calculations on the internet. We try to keep it simple and leave it at that. But these models are out there, and we show our work, unlike many of our opponents.
Next, Hyman Brown.
Structural steel is fireproof to last between 1 and 2 hours, which it did, and then steel melts.
Well, what he means is steel softens. But the problem is we don't just have softening steel out there. We do have melted steel. Where did that come from? In fact, it's pouring out of the South Tower, as you can see here, molten metal. What in the world is it? Well, NIST tells us this must be molten aluminum from the airplane. Problem is that molten aluminum looks silvery like that. We have structural engineers citing red-hot molten running from LIRA, Leslie Robertson's office. We have urban search and rescue workers seeing molten metal, red-hot steel being pulled from deep within the pile. What are the first responders? Demolition contractors, Peter Tully, who cleaned up this site. He was the president, saw pools of literally molten steel. I'm going to go very rapidly through this. It goes on and on and on. There are dozens of witnesses seeing all of this molten metal. What does it mean? Melted girders, says Abul Hassan Astani. Problem is, office fires don't get this hot. They don't get hot enough to make steel girders look like Swiss cheese, as documented in FEMA's Appendix C, which NIST then rejected from their final report. It's hidden. Intergranular melting capable of turning a solid steel girder into Swiss cheese.
I just mentioned
Louder.
The molten metal was only found under the 3 buildings that collapsed. And he also saw a picture of World Trade Center 5, which was burning fiercely. No molten metal under that building. It was only under the 3 buildings that collapsed that day. So just bear that in mind.
Very good point.